My name is Julia Summerdin. I'm a system engineer by training, and I work in telecom and mobile communication industry, specializing in system solution architecture and technical project lifecycle management. I'm passionate about applying system thinking and system dynamic concepts into solving large and complex system problems. Let me tell you a little bit about our next speaker, Michael Davies. Michael is the chairman of Endeavor Partners. He founded the firm in 2003 to fill the need for strategy consulting explicitly for digital and mobile business and decision making. Michael comes from technical background, had MBA from the London Business School and a master's degree in engineering from University of Cambridge and the University of Durham. Michael is passionate about applying system thinking into technical and leadership thinking. He always encourages his students to incorporate system thinking at a very early stage in their career. Thinking like CEO, thinking like leaders in large corporations, that's what he always encouraged his students to do. Michael believes social systems is really about leadership and behavior. Good leaders possess deep understanding of the interaction between system thinking, technical, and social systems. This is not a man who doesn't have one or two jobs or one passport. He has 7 jobs and 3 passports. This is a man who once confessed he's not good at saying no. He's the beloved father of 3 wonderful daughters, 21, 19, and 1. He's a Tesla car lover and owner. He uses his baby daughter as sensible purchasing justification. Let's welcome Michael Davies.
I'm actually going to begin by building on what the previous speaker said. You'll see why as I get into this. But let me start by saying what he said. Because I'm going to talk about some perspectives on leadership, and this idea of the incomplete leader is actually one of the key foundations that I'm going to build on in talking about what I think is the future of leadership. We'll see if I maintain technical mastery. So, I am, that slide is not presenting. Hang on, properly. Let's see if that works. Okay, I am honored first to be here why? Because first, I'm a long-time believer that systems thinking really matters. I actually started working with systems thinking about 30 years ago before it was widely called that. In my day, we were sort of focused on cybernetics as the discipline. I'm honored because it's MIT, and MIT is a really cool place. I'm also honored because some of the most insightful things I've heard in my career have been at various versions of this conference over the last few years. So I always try and make it a point of being here for as much of it as I possibly can because of that serendipitous learning where somebody says something that you take away and you go, actually, that was really cool. I'm delighted because as those of you who know me well, I really love talking. I'm opinionated, and having not said no to the invitation to speak and actually stopped and reflected on it, I think I've got something important to say. But I'm a little scared because I want to get it right. This is the first time I'm going to be trying to lay out what I think of as a sort of a new thesis or a new hypothesis. And I'm very conscious that I'm standing between you guys and the drinks. So there will be time for questions. And if we finish early, Joan, I hope that the drinks can be served early. I may be going manual here. So who am I? You've heard some of this. An engineer, an executive, an entrepreneur, and an educator. I've spent 25 years working with and leading professionals in high-tech and systems businesses, and now nearly a decade or so of teaching about it. What I set out to do originally when I was starting to think of this was I said, I want to reflect on my experience, and to the extent that I have any as a result of having spent a bunch of time thinking about it and reading about it, my expertise. And as I got into this, I actually found that what I thought would be most helpful and insightful was to look forward. So rather than looking back to what I've been through, I'm going to attempt to look forward to the future of leadership. And I'm actually going to try and make the connection between this and the world of leadership. This will be an iconoclastic presentation. I am fortunate that I own the company I work for, so these are both my views, and I'm now going to ascribe them as the views of Endeavor partners. It's one of the advantages of being an entrepreneur. I want to debunk some preconceptions. So things that you have widely heard about leadership, I am going to argue are completely wrong. On the other hand, there are some ideas, such as the importance of recognizing that we must all necessarily be incomplete leaders, as the previous speaker alluded to, which I want to reinforce. I want to introduce 2 or 3 alternative ways of thinking about leadership. And as those of you who've been in my class, I see some alums here, I said that I've only had an impact in anything I have to say if I have for the rest of your life changed to some small extent the lens through which you see the world. That's a high bar. And I'll set that bar up there because if I haven't done that, I'm wasting your time. This presentation is, however, what I'm going to call an MVP. It's not a minimum viable product, it's a minimum viable presentation. For those of you who are not familiar with the concepts espoused in things like the Lean Startup and 4 Steps to the Epiphany, the idea is a minimal viable product is the least you can do to get to the point where you can start getting good customer feedback. So I think of this as a minimal viable presentation. It allows for the connection of the maximum amount of validated learning. So I would like this actually to be the starting point for a conversation, good enough so that the audience, you guys, either in the Q&A session or afterwards, actually aid in validating or, to the extent that parts of it are wrong, debunking what I'm going to set out as a hypothesis. I will make the slides available, including a whole bunch of supporting reference material that underpins it, because I stand on and I will be quoting from the shoulders of giants, everything from Philip Graham, a couple of my former professors and now colleagues at London Business School like Rob Goffey, a guy called Charles Handy, who I think you should all know, Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson over at the Center for Digital Business, Bill Taylor, Peter Senge, who was one of the pioneers of thinking about learning as companies, Lawrence Bolt and Jim Collins. And on the shoulders of my colleagues, a couple of SDM graduates in particular helped with this. This came together through a whole lot of discussions with Dan Ledger and Lee Gautreaux, who work with me at Endeavor Partners. By the way, they have a very profound case of Stockholm Syndrome because they were both students and TAs and thesis students, and now we work together. So you can pretty much discount anything they have to say. And Justin Solar, who has been slaving long hours as one of our researchers helping put this together. I thought I needed to start with some definitions. Some of the graphics are slightly off. I apologize for that. It's one of those things that happens technically as you move from things. What are we talking about when we come to leadership? It's this process of social influence in which one person enlists the aid and support of others in the accomplishment of a common task. That's an important definition because it's this idea it's actually something done collaboratively, and where you are relying on others. Implicit in this is the idea of you can't do it yourself. I put this emphasis there because I was smart and I was a completely shit leader until I was about 30. I had the advantage of having a sort of strong technical background, but until I got into the middle of my MBA and into a relatively senior role, I relied upon a high level of individual expertise and competence. And suddenly at about 30, and this informs one of the reasons why I'm proudest of and most committed to being an educator, not just at the postgraduate level, but at the undergraduate level, this sudden realization that other people matter. So think of me as a reformed asshole. In essence, effective leadership consists of creating and sustaining the right common purpose with the right people for the right job. Let's also talk about what we mean by systems thinking. It was interesting because I went looking for the definitions for this. We pull it together. It's you putting the presentation together. Oh, that'll be the easiest slide to write because I'll just go look at the ESD website. No, not on there. I'll go look at the SDM website for the definition. No, not on that. Okay, what about the manual? What about this? And this actually turned into quite a long search for what do you mean by systems thinking? It gets alluded to. And I ended up writing this as a synthesis from a number of sources. Understanding how the elements of a system are connected and related, how they realize collective emergent behavior that's more meaningful than individual parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. A way of looking at the world. It's systems thinking. So viewing phenomena or as issues, reflecting a broader system rather than just looking at them in isolation. I think that second one is really important because for me that's one of the key things, particularly in the world in which we work, where we see lots of people identify issues or phenomena and focus on it without actually trying to understand what underpins it. And some would argue that the essence of this is really just properly bounding the system. It's some theory and some practice. Here, a particular focus on analyzing, predicting, and designing complex socio-technical systems. And we're concerned here with two domains. And as we started to reflect on this, we found ourselves talking about big system and little system. And the big system is the domain in which your organization works. So on the right-hand side here, and we work in high tech, we work in the adjacent sectors, and we work in sectors which are being profoundly transformed by what's going on. And that's what I'm going to drill into. That's the big system. The little system, the core system, whatever you want to call it, is actually the organization, this combination of clever people, groups, organizations, industries, although we would tend to say, and this is where I'm going to go, that what the future holds is actually a world of people, teams, organizations, and ecosystems. As the boundaries amongst them break down, as you abandon classical organizational structures, we're looking at a very different world. We're looking at a world, and the next question you have to ask yourself is, what is the function with which we're concerned here? And I'm going to argue passionately that the primary function here is actually innovation. So if I'm thinking about my system bounding, I've got to worry about the big system, I've got to worry about the little system. My end goal is harnessing information, and innovation is by far the single most important human activity. Who here in the room is an engineer? We're far more important than the rest of you. You know why? Because we're actually the people who underpin innovation. Scientists study the world and try to explain it. We create the world that has never hitherto been, and it's the most important human activity because everything a doctor does, or everything a physicist does, or everything a clinician does, or everything anybody does in any other sector relies upon the engineering that we created. And this is a chart of the impact it had. This shows for Sweden the rate of GDP growth. There's some other estimates which will be in the complete presentation looking back 1 million years or so about the point at which engineering started to emerge as a discipline, and you suddenly see this sharp kink in the rate at which we drive productivity and growth. And this remains important because if we're going to do things like lift Africa out of poverty, we're not going to do it by stopping growth. We're going to do it by actually creating enough surplus that we can do the sorts of things which means the hospitals in Africa struggling with Ebola don't look like they currently do, and they look more like MGH. Even though it took until 1990, anybody here an economist? 100 years of economics, they couldn't figure out that innovation was actually the most important thing, and that information goods, the other ones, because I was struck by this. This is Paul Romer, 2 seminal papers. Instructions for working with raw materials are inherently different from other economic goods. Once you've figured out the instructions, they can be used over and over again. So what we are concerned with, the objective function of the systems that we're thinking about, is about innovation in processing information. And this is by far the single most important human activity. My professional focus has been on these sorts of domains involving complex social technical systems, and we have some particular ways of developing theories and practicing them, and a bunch of you who've been through things like technology strategy have been exposed, corrupted, and developed Stockholm Syndrome as a result. Now the next question is, so how do I think about what is an organization? I was very heavily influenced in this by a professor I was doing my MBA at Charles Handy, to whom you should all be grateful to the extent that I'm less of an asshole than I was. Charles Handy, who was a very wise man, played a significant role in that, because one of the things he forced us to do as students was develop our own personal theory of organizations and organizing. a moment of deep introspection. And for me, an organization, when you look at them historically, is no more than a collection of people collaboratively working towards some common goal. That means the organization does not align its interests towards investors or customers, but to the people that compose it, their talent and their shared purpose. And that is the essence of an organization. The shared purposes for which we're aspiring are actually overall social as individual welfare. Organizations are a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And the thing that brought this into crystal clarity for me was Michael Tushman's great class at Harvard Business School on innovation organizations, which looks at why they fail confronted with transitions, and a whole bunch of studies which took as their measure of goodness and outcome longevity of a business, about which we shouldn't give a crap. That means if organizations come together to fulfill a common purpose, if that purpose goes away, give up and walk away. Accept that you as this particular collection of individuals are not any longer relevant. So that's my first big heresy. And there's a faction developed within Michael's class. It's a doctoral level seminar taught every 2-3 years. On one side, there were 2 of us and a couple of other people who had long experience in industry. And the other side were all the theoreticians who wanted to be able to measure company, the doctorates. And Liz Altman and I ended up in the faction being called she'd worked at Motorola, Cry Me a River faction. Oh, we're going bust. Well, cry me a river. Your purpose has been fulfilled. You're no longer relevant. Give up, go home, go do something more interesting. Organizations, the joint stock company, exists as a mechanism for allocating capital. We have better ways of doing it. It exists as an organizing mechanism for paying people. We have better ways of doing it. As part of that, how do I think about work? So if this is about leadership, what is the activity? The majority of your waking hours in your life will be spent with work. If you look at modern life expectancy, my father is 78 years old and still works full-time in a job which involves him flying around the world every 2 or 3 weeks. His particular specialty is if you've got a broken university system, this is how you go fix it. It's a great job because one of his clients is the University of the Seychelles, a couple of other interesting places. That means your careers will contain multiple shifting jobs throughout a variety of organizations. You should embrace as part of that this idea of serial reinvention and renewal. I had a fascinating breakfast this morning, Dan and I actually did, with an MIT grad who's just finished a stint as a very senior person working on the IT side of the federal defense industry, who's taking a year to reflect and reconsider and figure out what he's going to go do now. He's in his 50s. He's got another 20 years to work. I think I know what I want to do for the next 20 years, but it's different to what I was doing for the last 10 or the one between that. Secondly, balance work and life. This is an aside, but you can't. Parsing your responsibilities is impossible. Think about integrating them. So when people start talking about work-life balance, don't go down that path, because that implies there is life and there is work. And one of the facets of my life that I found most interesting is what I do professionally is deeply interlocked with what I do personally. I occasionally find myself in my professional persona writing to my wife to ask whether I can do something, or vice versa. In fact, I found myself doing it today for permission to ask her to reproduce some results from her organization. The thing that led me to say I should really be looking forward is coming out of a bunch of work we've been doing. I think we stand at a very fascinating and interesting point in the world. We are facing a perfect storm of creative destruction, which is going to transform the world of work, not just in the sort of organizations with which I'm familiar, but in every industry. 5 forces. Smartphones, pervasive connectivity, computing, the Internet of Things, and in particular, big data and machine learning. I'm not going to claim to be a domain expert. I do a bunch of work there. But if you've got any questions on that subject, we have an SDM grad in the front row who would be delighted to answer your questions on this. John? These 5 things put together lead to a very different world. The first thing you've got to deal with is, regardless of what sector you're in, customers are reaching the point where, and we characterize them as they're wizards. They have access to information anywhere, anytime, about anything, including sensing. You confront people and you put in their hand a modern smartphone with LTE connectivity, and it's caused the death of the pub quiz, because where I want to find out where my car is, or the state of its fuel, which in my case is electric, or what the temperature in my home is, or the answer to almost any arbitrary question, it is available sitting underneath my thumb. The nature of work is also changing in some fundamental ways. And again, working with another SDM alum, we did a lot of work on what does the future of work look like. Critically, modern consistent user interface, utilization of a great deal of automation and machine learning. Everything that is a routine administrative task that can be automated will be automated, and surprisingly rapidly. This is already starting to happen. So if you are in a job where you find yourself organizing legions of people doing quasi-routine administrative or clerical work, you are a dinosaur. And as part of this, a lot of these technologies are actually accelerating innovation and making innovation happen much more interactively. So there's actually a positive feedback loop here. We've got a classical SD situation going on, which is as the rate of innovation accelerates exponentially, we're getting better at doing innovation, and as the rate of innovation accelerates, we're getting better. We have a nice, tight, positive feedback loop going on, which means the pace of change is actually speeding up. Who's affected? Transportation, retail, education, healthcare, all at some point in terms of transformation. One of the things that made me sit down and say, I've got to write about this, was the most rapid change, until recently, I've ever seen in consumer behavior was in the course of 2 years, the number of people who used a smartphone to check stock availability and to look at pricing for products while in a physical retail store went fewer than 10%, about 1 in 3, pretty much everyone. Any of you who work in retail know this, and that rippled through. We saw in less than 18 months, it rippled through into the real estate market serving retail. So Class A real estate, the Copleys and the Harvards goes up. Class B mostly goes down. Class C implodes. Why? Because many of the reasons why you would go there have gone away, and absolutely brutal price pressure on retail. In transportation, significant changes. The thing I love, if you happen to be in the SDM building, is watching people's responses, and you can tell, merely by observing the rate at which laptops shut, whenever he knows a shuttle's going to arrive. You go back, so it's winter is coming, and I will be able to tell by just standing in the SDM lobby who has been tracking the arrival of the shuttle that's about to come in the middle of winter, because you don't want to stand outside for 10 or 15 minutes waiting for the shuttle to go to the far end of campus. You're looking in real time at it's coming, and everybody's doing this, and you hear this, snap, 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 which is laptop lids closing, rustle, 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 people running out the door. And then there's the last person running out, laptop cradled in one arm, relying upon the real-time information about the physical location of shuttles wherever they happen to be. Significant changes to the way in which that works. Just to sort of illustrate that with some examples, pretty much all of the modes of transportation I use, Hubway, the T, the MIT shuttle, and my Tesla, I'm critically dependent actually on an app on my smartphone to make them effective. If for those of you who use Hubway here in Kendall Square, crap, it's 5:12 and there's no bikes left in the 2 stands. By the way, there's a new one just on the far side of the main Kendall Square Plaza, which people don't seem to have found out about yet who don't use the app. So massive transformation. Technology, the good news is that this is radically increasing the economy's productive capacity. We're still in the point where, as they transform work, humans remain critical to creativity. And for those who haven't read about this, I will be putting up a bunch of the reference and the links back to the work that Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee are doing at the Center for Digital Business, where they're looking at this phenomenon in particular. Time doesn't allow me to talk in this particular speech about the deep and profound societal implications that this has. But for those of you who read The Economist, this is the central focus of this week's issue of The Economist. You want a shortcut? Go buy this week's issue of The Economist. It has a special report in it where they're talking about the third great wave of invention and economic disruption driven by a handful of technologies. Oh gosh, machine intelligence, ubiquitous web, and robotics that are creating lots and lots of things, but is also having a deep and profound potential economic impact. And there are a set of very interesting unanswered questions about that, which they're trying to confront from a broad macroeconomic perspective. But we still have to deal with fucking Microsoft. For a little while at least. Nothing else is running. So, by the way, one of the implications of this is that the PC is dead, or at least. I think we're probably okay. Let's try that. I know that was a big image that we were having trouble with. Can we try that? That means that second big heresy here, it isn't about all the people in your organization. Yes, as a leadership, that involves being humane about it. It's actually about the ascendancy of a few clever people. For those of you who haven't figured out the strange accent, this is what a New Zealander sounds like after you educate him in England and then he chooses to live here for nearly 20 years. But I'm using the word clever here. Let me be completely crystal clear. Not in the American sense of it, which tends to mean smart ass, but in the British sense, which tends to mean really smart. So when they're talking about clever, there's no sense here of, oh, he's really clever. This is, he's really clever. People with strong intrinsic motivation focused on something meaningful to them. It's a few key people who are going to make the difference, and that means that the leadership challenge is around these people. Working together in small teams. The number 5 keeps coming up in a whole bunch of the work I'm doing. It keeps coming up in consumer choice and forces and the rest, but teams are sort of 4 to 6. I don't know if anybody here is from my Slam Lab class, but we've just been through this and my mandating. Teams will be between 4 and 6 people. Yes, I see at least 1 people, and explaining the logic by it about optimal team size and free riding and communication. Moving quickly, being agile, making fast decisions, and in particular, leveraging systems thinking, understanding technical systems and the business ecosystem, well connected to external networks with robust mental models of how the world works. The old world was one of hierarchy, of joint stock companies with command and control. And we're now looking at a bazaar of open source ecosystems. Dan and I were having a fascinating discussion recently about, actually, is open source the only way to produce high quality software? Well, because in general, when you look at it, I hear a no, so we can have an interesting side debate about this, but let me put this out there. The argument was, open source is extraordinarily transparent and doesn't have time pressure. Any lack of transparency or any significant time and resource pressure tends to incur significant amounts of technical debt. So just putting that one out there as a thought. Small teams working within ecosystems, transient organizations. These are characterized by organizations that form and reform, a lack of continuity and uncertainty, an accelerated pace of innovation in which those who learn the quickest wins. And the key criteria, particularly in the early stages of startups, I'll come back to this, is actually the rate of learning. We're facing lower barriers to entry, a combination of things. Cloud service incubators, accelerators have dramatically lowered the cost of entry and of getting to MVP for many, many entrepreneurial ventures, even real physical world ones. So the ability to do prototyping, for instance, by working with people like Dragon Innovation and Bolt and using 3D printing, and actually you used to have to, there was a presentation this morning, bootleg stuff out of the machine shop here at MIT. Nowadays there's a whole bunch of people who exist to help you do that really quickly and really well, and actually connect you to large-scale manufacturing overseas as a mechanism for going to go do it. There is abundant venture capital. And again, an aside here for any of you who are interested in talking to it, there's a bunch of people out there who, rapacious as they are trying really hard to buy real options on ventures that scale big enough to disrupt even the very largest incumbents. That's their idea of what they're looking for. So if I'm investing in 10 companies, I'm not doing it because I love you. I'm not even doing it because some of you are going to be moderately successful. I'm trying to figure out which one of the 10 of you is going to come up with a thing that I can put tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into because you're attacking a market or an incumbent worth billions of dollars. That's what they're looking for. If you're attacking a target big enough, you're actually more likely to be well-funded, ironically. And this is unleashing a gale of creative destruction. So Schumpeter's process of industrial mutation that revolutionizes the economic structure from within. One of the things that characterized the Boston ecosystem, particularly as it matures, is it's one of only 2 or 3 in the world that have the size and scale and maturity that you watch ventures form and reform. So you watch people who worked together at particular ventures, the PayPal alumni, the Ware alumni, right? Some of the earlier startup alumni, the Lotus alumni, the DEC alumni who know each other, who've been through this, who come together again in new ventures. Minimum viable product. An approach to getting things into market by rather than doing a big waterfall. What is the minimum viable, important criterion viable that you can get to so you can actually test whether or not people really eat the dog food? You want an example? Uber started by utilizing waste in the transition. The thing that triggered me writing this up was a fascinating online discussion between a very classical Wharton-based, not an MIT economics professor, who said, I cannot conceive of any basis on which Uber is worth the amount of money that it's being valued at. And he started by saying, well, the taxi industry is about this big. And they could get this much of the taxi industry over that amount of time, and therefore there's nothing I can possibly see which justifies their valuation. So here's the reality, which is actually very different. They started by doing that. There were empty cars floating around, but they actually grew the size of the total investment market because they're creating new value as a supplement to transit. When you start looking at people who use Uber and people who use taxis, the user experience, because of a combination of smartphones, connectivity, a whole bunch of big data to figure out the routing and scheduling and support it, meant that you've actually got a better end-to-end experience. There's a core to the game in a game theoretic thing by putting this market together. They started to become an alternative to rental cars, and we are starting to see at the margin people who are not buying cars because they will use Uber instead. Because when you start looking at a car payment and looking at a combination of the T, Zipcar, Hubway, and some Ubering, you may be able to reduce your total expenditure. That money is coming out of the 1.3 trillion that goes into the automotive industry. And that's an addressable market which is 10 times big. Moreover, Bill Gurley disclosed in this post that the size of Uber's revenue in San Francisco, its oldest market, are already 3 times the size of what the whole of the taxi industry used to be. And it's only a couple of years old. It's also, it doesn't just disrupt how transportation is accomplished, it also reduces congestion. I'm sort of ambivalent about that because I actually think one of Boston's great sources of competitive advantage relative to the West Coast is we don't have to deal with US 101 and the schlep up and down the valley. We still have to deal with the red line, but bad as you think the red line is, it's infinitely better than 101. And you can get me on the complete, utter pointlessness of Google's self-driving cars because they're Google's response to the problem of, oh, I live in a shishi part of San Francisco and I need to get to the office. And because Northern California has no mass transit worthy of the name. So what does this mean for strategy, for imperatives for leaders? And I'm going to lay out 5, and some of them are building on things that are already widely advocated. I'm going to debunk a couple of others and introduce a couple of new ones. The first one is know yourself. Recognize that you are necessarily incomplete, and this is building on Deborah Ancona's work about the idea of the incomplete leader. Secondly, I'm going to drive home the importance of a leader in terms of providing meaning and purpose, because in this sort of world, actually finding and rediscovering purpose becomes remarkably important. I'm going to talk about not just learning yourself, because Bill Taylor, for instance, has written compellingly about the importance of learning as an individual, but actually accelerating learning in others, enabling other people to learn quicker, building systems, this whole systems thinking thing, that enables the organization that you're part of to learn more quickly, enabling creativity. There's a typo on this slide, I apologize. Enabling creativity, which is different from learning. Learning provides the foundation for it, and then there are some distinct environments that you need to do, supported by trust and actually giving people time and space to allow creativity around it. And lastly, creating systems that enable you to resolve decisions. So, first, embrace this idea of the incomplete leader. Secondly, you've got to focus on these few key people. They're motivated by intrinsic rather than extrinsic rewards. They do not want to be led. Let me make this completely clear. How do you respond? Military personnel accepted, but even from what I've just heard, it still applies to at least some of you, to being told what to do without an explanation. Just go do it. Like almost everybody who's been through somewhere at MIT, like almost everybody in the room, the almost universal perspective of people who have a spark of creativity and intelligence is, well, screw that. I'm going to do the exact opposite just because you told me to do this. That means as a style of leadership, command and control is inherently deeply counterproductive and destructive for the sort of people who are at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish, which is work with information to accomplish innovation. You're going to have to find a different systemic way of doing it. They want the freedom to explore and sail, but you've got to put some sort of systems and discipline in place. Tell them, don't issue instructions, lead with complementary expertise, convince that this business aligns with their sense of purpose and meaning them, shelter them, and actually empower them. It means that the second key thing you do, after having the humility to accept that actually there's a bunch of stuff you're really very bad at, is help your colleagues to discover purpose and meaning in their work. Remember, the phrasing of that is, I think, very important. It's discover it, rather than tell them what it is, rather than give it to them. All of your colleagues are actually more important than them. A few of them, and only a few of them, are key to success. They're motivated by intrinsic rewards. It's this idea of work is and will be a primary facet. So consider yourself an artisan in this respect, and work as life's art. Or as George Bernard Shaw put it, this is the true joy in life. The being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. And I count myself extremely fortunate because I get to do something that I love. Doing things that you love makes you more productive, it makes you happier, and by the way, makes you live longer as well. I use the word, co-discover purpose and meaning because the reality is that this is already going on. Startups often use a minimal viable product to facilitate user feedback. Every startup ends up pivoting at some point. That means we all come together and we're gung-ho and we're going to do this. And we are a band of brothers and there are 4 of us. You know what's going to happen? About 18 months out, we're going to figure out that what we're actually doing is wrong. And one of the 4 of us is going to go, hey, I don't want to do this shit anymore because we're going over here. And I thought we were going over here. And that means those of you who are left are going to have to go and figure out what new purpose is. I have been through that cycle with every startup I've been involved in. In fact, one of the key questions is, if you haven't been through that cycle, you've probably got it wrong. The same thing actually applies in large organizations focused with a transition, something like the sort of technological transition, the gale of creative destruction. And we do a lot of work with sort of big technology companies, and it's what I call, when we're doing strategy, when it's gone all metaphysical on me. And you see big companies with revenues measured in the tens of billions of dollars confronted with a significant challenge, actually literally having metaphysical debates about why are we here and what is our purpose and should we enter this new business and how does it fit with that. I've got exactly that debate going on with 3 of our 4 clients at the moment because they're confronted with, in one case, a big new opportunity sort of high up the stack. In another case, the sort of how do we expand horizontally? Do we pursue this set of multi-billion-dollar acquisitions? And what would that mean to our sense of who we are and how we run as an organization? And they're actually asking themselves, at board level, metaphysical questions about the purpose and meaning of life. Your role is to help people accelerate learning. Creating a safe environment that encourages learning, allows people to make mistakes. And by the way, this doesn't mean being a role model. You're providing coaching. So I'm going to debunk very strongly the idea that the right thing to do is to be a role model, because that implies you are the complete leader, and that the only learning mechanism is by observing what I do. Hey guys, just watch me. You know, I am a god, I am a leader, thank you very much. No. There are a whole variety of other ways to encourage and facilitate learning that don't involve being a complete leader and don't involve just being a role model. Be able to explain something even if you can't do it yourself. Leaders' learning is necessary but insufficient. Effective leaders, you've actually got to accelerate the learning of the entire organization, because in a fluid, in a fluid market and a difficult market for talent, your two big sources of advantage relative, the only thing that actually means there's any point in your coming together is because people feel more strongly about what you're doing, they have a high degree of commitment and passion to it, so they're more likely to be productive and be interested, and they're learning faster as a result of your building an environment that enables that to take place. Now, I'm building on what Sengi says. So Sengi talks in general senses about learning organizations, but I have a very specific focus here on we're not just trying to learn, we're actually trying to create learning around the domain in which we work, for which we have a specific purpose. Bill Taylor put it this way is, you're only as young as the new things you do, but it's the organization. You've got to keep learning through pivots and challenges rather than stale budgetary planning to ensure an adequate return on shareholder value. For success, learning is actually doing this faster. One of the things that I think is most interesting is when you look at the new ways in which innovation is taking place in the startup community, the key criterion for success is not the rate at which you accumulate customers in the early stages, or not even the rate at which you accumulate revenue. It's actually who gets to learn the fastest. So if you go and talk to Christina Chase at the Martin Center, or you go and talk to Abby Fichtner over at the iLab at Harvard, they're working with a startup at the early question. The question they will ask the startups over and over and over and over again is, what are you learning? What are you learning? How are you finding out about the customers? How are you finding out about the technology? What are you discovering about the business model? Because in that early stage, learning really quickly is the key, and then scaling rapidly. Now, one of the things that facilitates that, and this brings me back to one of the key contributions that systems thinking can make, is the importance of well-founded theory. So one of the things that I tell people to do is to focus relentlessly on the complete system. Build theories that allow testable predictions and that contain sound and robust models. So there is a direct linkage here from the way in which the world is changing and what you need as leadership behaviors to the powerful application of systems theory thinking as a lens to see what's going on and as a way of accelerating learning. And that means that, as some of you will know, there's 2 or 3 things which I keep telling people like students and thesis students they should go read. And one of them is Clayton Christensen's paper from 2003 on why even hard-nosed business executives should care about management theory, because it gives you good systemic ways of building causal relationships and constructs so you can actually say, hey, this is what might really be happening out there in the world. Leaders, not role models. Bill Belichick can't throw the ball like Tom Brady. He can't hit, well, he might be able to hit people like Will Falk. He's about the same weight, isn't he, nowadays? But he certainly can't run like Edelman. And I've been interested in Apple because they do a whole bunch of things wrong. Jobs didn't design much. Jobs was actually a critic. And there's some very interesting writing about the role he played, and the role he played was to challenge other people. He's not Johnny Ive, he's not Tony Fadell, he's not John Rubinstein, he's certainly not Tim Cook. His role was to challenge them as a critic or as a coach. So leverage systems thinking to understand your ecosystem, to understand and model your organization, its behaviors. We've had in my own small firm a couple of systems failures recently, and we actually use exactly those words to characterize them. We missed a deadline on a presentation. It's the first time it's happened to me in about half a decade. And we sat down. Fortunately, we have a couple of SDM people here, and we're partway through an after-action review to basically go, borrow that from them. We take the military after-action review concept and marry it to systems thinking and pull it apart and go, what were the proximate causes of failure, what were the underlying causes of failure, what are the deeper systemic behaviors that we will need to change going forward. So this doesn't point the finger at an individual, it goes searching for the systemic underpinnings of the sources of failure. You've got to build an effective mechanism to make decisions at high speed, you've got to facilitate learning, and you've got to enable creativity. So let me recap on that. What work will be? Organizations and careers are transitional. Organizational success will depend upon a set of a few clever people. Small fluid teams of said clever folk will be productive. Agility is key. Leaders nowadays are going to be, it's much more about time and emotional engagement and making quick decisions. So this is an MVP. It's a minimum viable presentation. It's meant to set things up to start a dialogue about what is going to be very different about leadership and organizations and the big system, which is changing dramatically. The big system is changing, so you're going to have to change the small system, and that has profound implications for leadership. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Professor Davies?
Hello, excellent MVP. Really enjoyed it, and definitely agree with you that boundaries are collapsing in organizations and their networks and their constellations or ecosystems. What I would like you to touch upon are the feedback loop or the reciprocity with how, as boundaries are collapsing in general, organizations and their ecosystems are able also to change the broader, the macro system that that exists, that kind of across everything. And you touched upon it, I think, in terms of technology and what engineers are doing. But that's just, I think, that's just a drop in the ocean.
I think it is. So my answer to that is yes, I think. So I've got, let me organize thoughts. My answer is yes and no, and then yes. So the first question is, can organizations do that? I have an observation to make, in particular from working with one of my thesis students on this, is that some organizations, however much they pay lip service to us, if they haven't actually been through the process of building and orchestrating ecosystems from scratch, and they somehow inherited them, think Microsoft or Intel, almost nothing they do makes them capable of building an ecosystem, because they have no theory of mind. They're used to being in charge, so although they pay lip service to the idea of building an ecosystem, they pour money into it, they haven't got the theory of mind to actually walk around and say, okay, I'm a designer, why would I work with you? And that is being reflected in systemic failure. So the writing is on the wall for Microsoft and Intel more than anything else, because they're not actually any good at walking in anyone else's shoes. So that was yes and no. Some organizations can. I'm an optimist about this because I'm seeing signs that even some of the largest organizations in the world who, if they've started to shift their thinking, and in particular if it's permeated the high levels of management, are starting to look at this through a very different lens. If I was going to call one organization out in particular, it would be the shifting perspective that Unilever, for example, is adopting the FMCG sector, where they've gone from basically thinking of themselves as a pipeline as actually being, as they are, an integral part of the communities in which are involved, and actually adopting a perspective that says, I am an actor in an ecosystem rather than just somebody who's trying to shift product and put it out the door. Sidebar, by the way, it's one of the things that Apple does differently. So when they're thinking about their ecosystem, they don't think about individual product sales. They think about their customer base as an installed base. And they're actually thinking about the fact they want to keep interacting with you, which is why even though it's down a couple of percentage points, their retained loyalty is so much higher than anyone else's. I'm sorry, I've spent a lot of time recently looking at what's called flow share data, who goes from which ecosystem to which, and who are the net gainers and who are the net losers. Sure.
Hi.
Did that answer your question? Thank you.
Hello from another expat Kiwi with an unrecognizable accent. I had a question about, you talk a lot about the tech sector and how that can be rapidly disassembled and remade and a new company can come in. But there's a lot of sectors like oil and gas, or in my own, which is healthcare, where there are large capital investments and these seem much less movable. Do you see these kinds of motions happening in that same way?
The answer to that question is yes in general, but it depends. So I thank you, because the question helps deal with what I think is a central issue. I'm going to quote a client on this, because I was running an exec ed for a group of top management, and I said of this particular client, who's in the broadly the financial sector and the information services sectors, and they had thought of themselves forever as a content business, and I said, you're now a technology business. And actually their CTO turned, and there was a muttering going on, and their head of marketing said, actually everybody is a technology business. You just don't know the extent to which you are yet, and it's happening at different paces. So the greater the extent to which your industry is defined by very large-scale idiosyncratic physical assets and or tight regulations which are around for a long while, the longer it's likely to take. Granted, oil and gas, a long while. But retail, which people used to think of as a sector which was not a technology sector, has been transformed into a technology sector. And the only difference is some of them get it and some of them don't. So my pushback to all of you is, if you just, as a knee-jerk, say, we're not, this isn't going to happen to us, you're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And in healthcare, for instance, we're doing a whole bunch of work with different people in the healthcare sector, because there's a bunch of very interesting bottom-up innovation going on in terms of the way in which the complete life cycle of people taking care of their health and wellness is going on, which will have a big impact. Yes, the incentives are changing, but we're creating instrumentation and availability of what goes on from an end-to-end basis. And I spent with one of my colleagues an hour or so on the phone with one of the senior IT people in one of the biggest healthcare companies in the world. And they're basically going, there are two big challenges we face. One is the shifting incentives system here in the US. And the other is the rate at which technology is changing our business, whether or not we like it. So it varies by sector. Transportation, retail, healthcare, education, oil and gas, right? Does that answer your question?
You
Top left.
mentioned several times the need to create safety.
Yes.
And I wondered what that was.
It's an environment which you create trust. And the reason that that's important is a combination of things make people feel that the organizational environment within which they're working is one in which what is happening is transparent. So that there's not the sort of sense about that if you're going to make decisions, they're going to be made in a way in which you are involved in the process and you understand them and you evolve and involve them. And the reason that that's important is if you want to create the ability to fail, and maybe this is it depends on the environment which you're doing, but if you're concerned with innovation, anybody here who's ever done any work on experimental design says, you should fail 50% of the time. You should fail 50% of the time because that's the rate at which you're maximizing the rate of learning from the experiments. So if you're trying to design experiments, if you're doing experimental design, and you're pretty sure it'll be right, you're not gathering much information. If your criterion is laid of information, so you've actually got to let people do it. And one of the key roles that you then play as a leader in doing this is, if you are doing this and you're working with people, then you should be ready when things are about to go pear-shaped. Sorry, does that translate? I know it's a Kiwi. Is pear-shaped a Kiwiism? Oh, okay, good. I can't usually tell, but if things are about to go pear-shaped, one of your roles as a leader is not to turn around and point the finger at people or beat them up, it's to figure out how you're going to cover for it. And so, we had a systems failure. I take it. I take the shit from the client. Why? Because that's my role. And in this particular case, I looked at where we were, and it was systems failure because with 12 hours to go, I knew we just couldn't possibly get there unless I stayed up all night. And I'm too old to be doing that. So I worked through with the explanation to the client and the apology and the rescheduling and the rest, because your role is to protect people so they learn, right? And you work through this with, Another one of my colleagues, I don't know if he's in the room, ran a presentation the other day a little close. But without learning from that, they wouldn't have learned. Does that answer your question?
A benign comment, if I made reference to your first, second slide, only to tell engineers build what scientists discover, and in support of my fraternity. Besides, this is the week where the Nobel Prizes are being awarded. At least this week, we might grudgingly recognize scientists who contribute to something.
Oh, I'd argue the chemists who figured out how to do fluorescence were actually really engineers. That's engineering. Cool. Thank you. Joan, all yours.